I would like to welcome you to the discussion marking International Anti-Corruption Day. We think about corruption and how to control it every day of the year, but on International Corruption Day, we want to draw extra attention to one aspect of the problem. This year, the World Bank is drawing attention to the complexities and consequences of corruption and state capture in fragile settings. The term fragility can mean many things, and there's no single type of fragile environment. Similarly, the word corruption can mean many things, and it is present in all countries. But it is the way that the complexities of corruption and of fragility interact with each other that can make the problem difficult and dangerous. We hope that by untangling these complexities, we can find practical solutions to these problems. To help us do that today, we have asked Karen Allen to moderate the discussion between our distinguished panelists. Karen is Senior Research Advisor at the Institute of Security Studies in Johannesburg, where she leads the Emerging Threats in Africa program. I can't imagine any bigger threats to Africa than corruption and fragility. So before turning things over to Karen, though, we'd like you to watch a short video message from Mari Pangestu, the World Bank's Managing Director for Policy and Partnerships, on the importance of this problem. Please watch it carefully, both because Mari is smart and sincere, and more importantly, she's my boss.
As we mark International Anti-Corruption Day, we want to remind everyone of the importance of corruption, which has long been recognized as a major impediment to development. This year, we are focusing on corruption in places affected by fragility, conflicts, and violence, or FCV, because corruption is a major driver of FCV. Estimates suggest that by 2030, between 43 and 60% of the world's extreme poor will live in FCV contexts. Furthermore, conflicts drive 80% of humanitarian needs and on average reduce GDP growth by 2 percentage points per annum. Tackling poverty in such contexts requires addressing corruption. But addressing corruption in FCV is not easy. Institutions that keep corruption in check, such as open government policies, anti-corruption agencies, the justice system, civil society, and the media, are often non-existent, weak, or captured. In turn, ordinary people face corruption when they try to obtain basic services or sustain their means of livelihood, which can lead to unrest or make it harder to build legitimacy of the state. Addressing this complex issue in the difficult FCV context requires partners in government, private sector, civil society, and the donor community to work together. Let me reiterate the World Bank Group's commitments, both to this important agenda and working with all partners to better the lives of the poor living in the FCV countries. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you find the discussion today to be insightful.
Well, thank you, Indermit and Mari. Well, for International Anti-Corruption Day this year, the World Bank is drawing attention to the challenges, complexities, and the consequences of corruption in fragile settings, as we've just heard. And we know the term fragility can mean many different things to many different people. The most recent Pandora Papers have drawn attention to the fact that rich countries often contribute to the problem. The complexities of corruption and of fragility are huge and can interact with each other, but we hope that by unpacking some of the issues, we can find some practical ways forward. We have three very distinguished guests to help share their reflections on this extremely difficult topic. We have Sarah Chayes. Her career has taken her from reporting for National Public Radio, covering the fall of the Taliban in Afghanistan, to running a soap factory in downtown Kandahar in the midst of a reigniting insurgency. She went on to work as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs before moving to a 5-year stint at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's the author of the prize-winning book, Thieves of State, Why Corruption Threatens Global Security, and on corruption in America and what is at stake. We have John Githongo with us as well. He's the CEO of Inuka. It's a non-government organization involved in governance issues and broadly defined and corruption specifically, with an emphasis on working with and for ordinary Kenyans. And the focus is particularly on youth. He's held many distinguished positions within government and for NGOs. He remains a weekly columnist for the Star newspaper in Kenya and occasionally for other international press, such as the Guardian newspaper and the Yale Global. John's also a senior advisor to the Office of the President of South Sudan on governance. Scott Guggenheim is an anthropologist with 25 years of experience in international development, with a keen interest in how local knowledge and local voice can be heard in development issues. He's lived through some very, very tumultuous events, including his years with the World Bank, which included him helping Indonesia pick up the pieces after the East Asia crisis and then the Aceh tsunami. After leaving the World Bank, he worked in Afghanistan, where he served as a senior advisor to the president. He's currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And just a tiny bit about myself. My name is Karen Allen. I'm moderating this interesting discussions. I'm particularly thrilled and privileged to be moderating this particular panel, over whose selection I have to add I had no influence whatsoever. Like Scott and Sarah, I also worked in Afghanistan, in my case as a correspondent for the BBC, where the transactional nature of peace building, like in so many other settings, was clear. I met Sarah Chayes in Washington shortly after she published her excellent book, Thieves of State. As a bit of a fan, I explained to her at the time how relieved I was that someone was actually writing about this issue for a mainstream audience. Often corruption is something that is seen very much in academic or policy-making circles. And what her book really does is to be able to nail it and actually describe and visualize corruption for ordinary people. As our guest, John Githongo, well, John's been something of an anti-corruption mentor to me for the past 17 years. I was based in Kenya for many years. And actually, one of the first stories I covered was the courageous whistleblowing from inside the presidency of the man who was basically tasked to look at corruption, but who ended up looking too closely into some of the dark spaces where political elites did not want him to go. I have a huge, huge respect for John Githongo. He is widely regarded internationally as an anti-corruption expert. Since leaving the BBC, I'm consulting for a number of different organizations on global governance issues and security issues. We had mentioned there the Institute for Security Studies. And for that reason, I've been asked to assist in moderating this discussion on a topic I feel rather passionately about as well, just like our guests. We really want this to be a forward-thinking discussion. We don't want it to be mudslinking, for want of a better word. We want it to be constructive conversation. So I'd really invite our guests to be candid, brief, but also please be a little bit forward-thinking. So let's start by trying to unpack the links between corruption and fragility. Often a view that's heard is that a degree of corruption is almost an inevitable part of a political settlement. I'm just wondering, what do we know about corruption in political settlements and vice versa? we hear the word peace at any price. It's a narrative that we've seen reflected around the world. Sarah, can I put that to you? Where do the two link? Where do they join? And are we always too eager to achieve peace at any price?
I actually think, thank you, Karen. It's great to see you again. I actually think that we are too eager to achieve whatever our primary focus is, be it peace or be it delivering vaccines, and corruption kind of gets pushed to a back burner. A second thing I think is important to realize is that we're living in a period, I think now, I mean, money is always popular, right? But I think we're living in a moment in history where money has taken over other values as the sort of yardstick by which people measure their social standing. And so peace settlements end up being less than they may have been in the past about power and much more about the money. And so if corruption ends up being the sort of pot that split up among previously warring factions, the problem is they're not going to let go of it. And then the prospects of future violence become quite high because the population gets sick of it. The population is the victim of corruption and becomes indignant. So one example might be the Balkans, where it hasn't exploded again, but what you've really ended up with as a result of the peace at any price approach is a criminalized state. And I think the Horn of Africa is a more violent example of that kind of thing. But I think John may have more insight into that than I do.
Yeah, we're working in South Sudan at the moment, John. Just, give us an insight, that peace at any price narrative. Is it being driven by the money at all price and the idea, the danger of having, more and more fingers in the trough or fingers in the till?
Well, I mean, I agree with Sarah, especially when you're coming out of a period of tremendous instability. You're also talking about a huge sum of money coming into a society to fix everything, and so there's money coming into health, into education, into roads, into infrastructure. So there's that combined with an elite that has a sense of entitlement as well. These are people who've suffered all sorts of privations. There's been a settlement. Some of them have been in the bush, fighting liberation wars. And the sense of entitlement that we made the peace, and we deserve to benefit from it. I want my nice house with a swimming pool, a car, etc., etc. And especially when the demobilization of armed actors has not been complete, then the corruption becomes baked into the entire governance infrastructure that is set up, because you have elites that where the corruption is normalized from day one, and unfortunately, as I said, those who are spending the money, the donors who are providing the resources, become inevitably complicit in a sort of relationship that is seen as essential, but everyone is so relieved that there's peace. So the money keeps on being spent, keeps on being stolen, really in front of everyone's eyes. It's not really something that is that hidden in that kind of situation, especially when you're talking immediately after a conflict. People are just very relieved that there's peace, and the elite have a sense of entitlement to fatten their bank accounts.
That word entitlement, John, is so resonant, isn't it? And let's just bring Scott in here. I mean, in terms of the settings where you've worked, is that a driving factor, that there is a sense of entitlement often among the elites that are involved in peace settlement, and that drives corruption further?
Well, you're asking me a complicated question, because I think both Sarah and John are completely right on a limited number of cases, and in the majority of cases, but there are exceptions to that. And so let me just throw a cat in the pigeons for a second here. So if you look at after the Aceh peace agreement in North Indonesia, actually that peace is held with tremendous corruption for the past 30 years. And it's held for two different reasons. One of which is there's no donors. And so the kind of money they're sharing, there's a fair amount of money coming from Jakarta to the provincial elites. So it is getting that sense of entitlement in there. And there is a lot of money flowing through. It's very corrupt, but it's also growing very fast. So everybody is getting a little bit better off. A lot of people at the top are getting much better off. And on top of that, you had a peace agreement that sort of bought in a whole bunch of people who were in the conflict before, and they could afford to do that. The other thing that came into the Aceh peace agreement that's also important is that it became much more religiously conservative with much more strict sanctions for people who violated the agreement among the various elites, including the people who were the former insurgents. So I completely agree with what they said. I'm just saying at certain angles here, there are exceptions to that are worth studying in more detail. And of course, as you know, nobody ever studies Indonesia, even though it's the fourth largest country on earth. But it does offer some interesting examples of corruption with peace and growth and stability that actually are interesting to look at least from an analytical side, without undermining the case that if people think that peace at any cost that any cost part means something significant, they're completely off track. Right? You start off with elite deals that are wildly corrupt. You get the other place I've worked, which is Afghanistan, right? And there it was one failure after another because the price of the elite bargain was institutionalized corruption at every level of the state.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I just wonder, we're talking about fragile settings, and I just want to know really the relationship between fragility and corruption. I mean, do we see a situation where corruption is fueling fragility, conflict, even violence, or does actually corruption exacerbate the problems, or is it the underlying problems that generate the corruption in the first place? That sounds quite a sort of roundabout question, but John, can you shed some light on that, please?
I think and I'll piggyback on what Scott just said, just to also come in a roundabout way to answer that question. One of the big lessons after 30 years of being involved in the fight against corruption, for me about 25 years, we are sort of assessing ourselves in a fairly brutal way now, and acknowledging that billions of dollars have been spent in the fight against corruption, institutions have been created, et cetera, et cetera. In many countries, not much has been achieved by all these institutions. And then you have massive contradictions that we need to learn from, coming out of Asia, for example, where you have, in some countries, very high levels of corruption, but at the same time, very rapid economic growth and millions upon millions of people being lifted out of poverty at the same time. So that requires study in that, what about these situations where you have high levels of corruption, but very, very rapidly increasing inequalities that are then militarized, politicized and militarized and blow up. One of the lessons, I remember in the early 1990s, Transparency International started in 1993, 1998, the World Bank took it on. Jim Wolfenson mentioning the C word, and it became part of the core development agenda. By 2003, we had the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And I think one of the challenges, it's great to be here with Sarah and Scott, is that economists took over the study and understanding of corruption. It became, the principal agent model, and that you could twig and play around with incentive system, the incentive structure to change the behavior of human beings. Sadly, after 30 years, we admit that's complete nonsense. It doesn't work. It's completely irrational. The person who has got $10 million wants $100 million. Once they have $100 million, they want $200 million. They have one yacht, which costs $20 million. They want $100 million. It's so, this sort of rational kind of model has failed. And so more than a transaction, corruption is a relationship. It's about relationships in a society. And therefore, you have those societies where, just relationships of reciprocity, patrimonial relationships where you can have high levels of corruption, high levels of growth, and a level of stability, especially amongst the elite, when, as it quote unquote, in a way, the fat is being spread around, that keeps it going, and in a manner that it's quite stable. At a certain point, the elite itself realizes that this model is expensive, and they begin to ask for a set of rules that apply to everyone, so that they can continue to profit. So I think that's, for me, one of the big lessons of at least all of my work of the last 25 years, is realizing, no, this is a relationship. There's corruption in every society, but corruption is like crime and other things. It's there. They're accelerators and intensifiers that come in, and you look at Afghanistan, where despite very, very noble objectives, some of the noble objectives help to fuel sort of it's like steroids into the contradictions that are there that are driving the corruption. So if you look at corruption as a relationships in society, for too long we viewed corruption as bad people doing bad things. In actual fact, most of corruption is good people being forced to do bad things. Mm-hmm. Majority of people who are poor don't bribe because they want to. They bribe because they're forced to. It comes to them as extortion. You're a poor person, you're walking alone at night, you're stopped by a group of drunk policemen, they ask you for $1, or you're going to be held in a cell, or the consequences of not paying that $1 are so disproportionate. You paid. Unfortunately, that's what corruption looks like to the majority of people in the world.
There is a logic there, John. I mean, I want to throw something to you, Sarah, if I may, just based on your experience. There's almost, I'm using this word ambient corruption, if you like. And not that there's a level of corruption that becomes tolerable, but it is present and it is lived with. I mean, just in terms of your experiences, particularly in Afghanistan, but maybe also in Nigeria, I mean, is that something that is possible to live with? I mean, in the sense that is it something that potentially can erode a society and expose it to fragility and some of the consequence of corruption? Or do you think actually the pragmatic thing is that there is a level of ambient corruption that we've just got to live with? That's not being defeated. It's just being realistic, as John's explained, that actually for many people, living in a society where corruption is pervasive is a very logical metric that they use.
Who has to live with it? When we say we have to live with it, we're not living with it, right? And what I experienced in Afghanistan was Afghans couldn't stand to live with it. And in the end, enough of them were so indignant about it that they joined the Taliban. Or certainly, and a great deal more said, look, the government smacks me on this, the Taliban smacked me on this cheek, and the government smacks me on the other cheek. Meaning, if the government is as hostile to people's interests as an insurgency is, or even more, if an insurgency capitalizes on the indignation at corruption, which is true of Boko Haram, it's true in Uzbekistan, or has been true in Uzbekistan, was certainly true in Afghanistan, then, you get more than fragility, you get, violence and conflict. I'd love to come back around and just touch on a couple of points that have already come up. One is you did ask us to be forward looking. And so I'd just like to put a word in about political settlements going forward, that given how much the world is understanding about the corrosive and explosive potential effects of systemic corruption, what if peace agreements such as we've seen in the past were explicitly understood to be transitional, with off-ramps built in that would bring the polity toward that would prevent the corruption from being, as John put it, baked in and normalized by that political settlement. And so I'm just wondering whether the peace building community in the future could take this into consideration more than has been done in the past, where it's all been about the fighting. I think Colombia may be an interesting example on that. And on, do the problems create the corruption, or the corruption create the problems? I actually think that's a very interesting question that's been misunderstood a lot in the past. I don't know how many times I've heard, oh, there's a lack of governance, therefore corruption creeps in. In fact, I would put it somewhat differently. I think that, I think there's an acronym now that we're using for fragile. What is it? Fragile, violent, and conflict places. And
yes,
it used to be
right. CV.
Right. It used to be fragile and failing, didn't it? You remember? Yeah. So my point is, fragile and failing states may be fragile and failing as states, but they are usually run by incredibly sophisticated networks. This goes to John talking about relationships. They're run by sophisticated networks that are absolutely successful at achieving their objective, which is the enrichment of their members. And so, what I would say is that the fragility or the problems that you're talking about, Karen, are a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
Because the role of the network members who control state institutions or agencies is in fact to bend and twist those agencies so that they serve the interests of the members rather than the interests of the population. And the ones that they can't do that with, the ones they can't weaponize, they either cannibalize for their budgets or they undermine them by not paying, leaving empty positions, for example, the ghost soldiers that we saw in Afghanistan, Iraq, and as one example. And I would say from my own country, I mean, in the United States, we saw vast swaths of the U.S. civil service go empty for years. And I would argue that it's a very similar process where you hollow out or deliberately cripple important elements of state function because they might get in the way of the money-making process. And as a result, you have a fragile or failing state. If you'll allow me to focus on the West for just a moment here. You mentioned the Pandora Papers, and they were really focused on the enabling and facilitating that is done by certain jurisdictions and in particular service providers. But I would just like to put something else before you. Let's take a look at the last 20 years. Again, speaking as an American, we've had 2 lost wars. We've had a financial meltdown that almost brought down the world economy. And we've had an opioid crisis, which has killed about as many people as COVID has in the United States. And we have had runaway environmental devastation. Now take a look at the fortunes of the executives of the financial services industry, defense contractors, real estate industry, real estate speculators, if I might, the pharmaceutical giants and the fossil fuel giants. These people have been cycling in and out of the United States government, and they have certainly influenced the United States government. And look at the colossal failures of the policies that they've been involved in seeing implemented, and then look at how rich they are. And I would just like to submit, is the United States not a fragile state? And is it not this kind of network corruption that is producing the problems?
We're going to talk about the types of corruption and network corruption in just a moment. But yes, you did raise the question, is the United States a fragile state? Thinking about more conventional framing of fragile states, you talked about, Sarah, this idea of transitional peace agreements, that may be a way of making there be less of an incentive for corruption. But I'm just wondering, and I want to put this to you, Scott, is there not a danger? I mean, what do you think about that proposition from Sarah? But also, is there not a danger that with transitional agreements, there's almost an urgency that you've got a small window of opportunity to grab what you can, make as much money or as many deals as possible, because it may just be a short opportunity to be able to sort of feather your nest or generate more personal wealth? I'm putting it very clumsily, but I think you get my point. Scott.
Yeah. So it depends what happens after your peace agreement gets started, right? So if this is part of the opening for building a more sustainable peace, that where resources get discussed more, where there's more accountability and more discussion, I think it is good to take steps back and take a look. The point of what Sarah's suggesting, which I like a lot, is that a lot of the design of what comes through a peace agreement and right after a peace agreement sort of sets the stage for the next 20 years of what's going to happen. And corruption tends to be incidental to that. Now, and I think she put her finger on the reason why that is that people look at a peace agreement as a way that we're inviting everybody into the tent and everyone gets a share of it. And as a result, you're going to end up with institutionalized corruption, which is what we see in so many of these places. And people seem to think that's a necessary cost. And I'm on Sarah's side that it's absolutely not. Right? You can get peace agreements that are much less destructive to a society and have more of a virtuous circle instead of a negative circle. And what you're looking for, where would be the entry points so that instead of saying it's a fact of life and we're going to watch it all go downhill, pour in tons of donor money and hope that some of it trickles down, you have a better approach that's sort of strengthening the way that people are able to put in controls and enforce agreements. And if people don't like it, they say that's part of the enforcement of what we actually agreed on. And again, I come back to that weird example. I mean, Indonesia always cracks me up. Friends of mine say it was actually inhabited by Martians because the peace agreements in Indonesia are pretty corrupt overall. But over time, they've been able to at least control the corruption to the point where there's enough stability and growth. So it's still pretty corrupt, but it's also pretty stable. And that whole model that you're going to go downhill like we saw in Afghanistan, actually that didn't happen. And this is in a country with 1,000 languages, 15,000 islands, pretty weak institutions overall. And as John was saying, there's some pretty interesting lessons to look at, getting away from the moralistic approach to thinking about corruption and how evil it is, and looking at more of the institutions and political and social processes they put in place to make sure that it wouldn't undermine the peace agreements and get going forward. I'm not trying to put it off as the world's perfect country, but it's an interesting country because of that. And I think there are lessons to look at about pragmatic deals and how they happen, including where your red lines are. And that's one of the things that Indonesia and the East Asian countries do pretty well. They lay down boundary areas where corruption can happen, but they have a sufficiently strong enforcement mechanism that people who go outside of that. In Indonesia, anyone who does what Boko Haram does would be crushed. Right? It's not even up for discussion. They have a strong enough army and a very strong, committed central state that would crush that. The famous case of the Indonesia Anti-Corruption Commission, right, which has been since it's been dismembered, but at the time for the past 20 years, it worked pretty well because it kept indicting mid-level officials. And at one point, like 1/3 of all the provincial officials were under some kind of indictment with a 99% conviction rate. Well, that really didn't threaten anybody's elite interest, but it was putting a damper on claims from below into the national wealth. Was it a good thing to do? Well, yeah, by and large, I think it did increase trust in the state. But the more important point was that it laid down the limits of how much undermining can be allowed to be done. And you had a state that was strong enough to enforce that. So they're pretty flexible and broad, but they were enforced. Anyone who's read, I think Yuan Yuanang's brilliant book on China sees something somewhat similar to that. There's red lines you have, and within that you can negotiate, but you better not cross those red lines. So I would say from a practical implication, and Sarah, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, but I think one of the big mistakes that people made in Afghanistan was they cut an elite deal that had everybody buy into that, and then they made sure there'd be an executive that would never be strong enough to enforce any of it or have enough interest in making sure that they could actually get a growing economy instead of an aid-dependent economy. I think we're going to come back to that. I
think so. Can I broaden this out a little bit? And you talked about sort of Indonesia and having an anti-corruption infrastructure that was able to at least hold people to account up to a point. And as you say, one of the big assumptions is that there is a mature enough state infrastructure that can actually support that. John's had direct experience of that as what we used to call an anti-corruption czar in Kenya. I know your title was much, much more erudite than that, John. But I want to put one question to you. We heard Scott mention the term incidental corruption, and I've used it in a slightly different way. What I mean by those that are engaged in trying to weed out corruption or trying to reduce or minimize or investigate corruption, including international organizations. How high is the risk of those that might be involved in trying to reduce corruption actually being tainted or inadvertently corrupted themselves? What I mean by that, and that's why I say incidental corruption, being embroiled in corruption without even knowing it. How easy is it for people or organizations that are trying to deal with that very problem, particularly in fragile states? How much do they face the pitfalls of being offered access, political access, favors, travel incentives? You know, what are the dangers that go with that as someone who's had experience on the ground?
It's actually you could describe it as a danger or a fact of life. I've known Sarah for X amount of time. We've interacted in many other ways. She's appointed to, I'm appointed to this position. There's Sarah. Because I know her, when I see her number come up on my mobile phone, I'll pick it up. This is Sarah, and I happen to have a problem. I happen to have a relative who's undergoing a sensitive operation in a hospital, and I'm completely consumed by it. I'm a public official, and I end up asking Sarah, Sarah, can you loan me $5,000? I just need to do this. Sarah is good-hearted. We've known each other, so this what is corruption does not arrive wearing the mean face that is on billboards around the world. It comes actually quite softly in that way. It comes with relatives. It comes with friends. It comes with relationships that are being massaged. And one of the other lessons for me that emerges from that there has been a big focus, especially at the start of this sort of when corruption became central to the development agenda in the early 2000s onwards. Frying the big fish. Fish rots from the head, so we need to go after the big guys, and then that makes a big difference. But in actual fact, one of the lessons, and Scott mentioned, the work about studying China, which is absolutely fascinating in this regard. That actually one of the biggest impacts one has, and our own research in Kenya found that the greatest negative impact of corruption, the most dramatic one that is picked up by the media, is the corruption of the elite. Because of the conspicuous consumption, their houses, their cars, their international trips, and captures everyone's imagination. In actual fact, a corrupt elite that understands that it needs to manage the petty corruption in order to maintain social stability is able to get more done. And ultimately, this is still a work in progress, but so long as you can lift that load off the backs of the poorest in society, that they're not being shaken down by every interaction they have with government officials, then trust in institutions and especially the governance institutions goes up, and a level of stability can be found. Secondly, and this is an important time in history, as Sarah mentioned when we started, the whole anti-corruption agenda has been built on, when people like me got into it, for example, was on a basic set of values and principles. And the sense was that the West, led by the US, had everyone's back in this struggle against in the fight against corruption, for good governance, human rights, etc., etc. We have to accept now, today, that has changed. And therefore, we have to engage with a whole range of new actors and partners who are increasingly projecting both soft and hard power around the world. The Indonesians, the huge, giant country, and they are here. They are here in a country like Kenya, Tanzania, in Uganda. They are here. They just don't blow the trumpets that hard. Thailand, Turkey, Russia, etc. There's a whole range of new, very, very consequential actors in this anti-corruption firmament that, in a sense, the retreat of the US and the West, they've come into play, and we have to engage them if we're going to be serious going forward.
John, that's a really good point. You've used the term petty corruption and grand corruption. I want to put this to Sarah or Scott, whoever wishes to answer this in the first instance. Do you have a view on which is more important to focus on? Or is it both for different reasons, given the circular relationship between the two? Do you basically win the confidence of the public by dealing with the petty bribes that they're having to pay to get services, for example, medical services or at a checkpoint? Or do you deal with the big guys first? Sarah, do you want to take that in the first instance?
Yeah, I'm not sure I actually accept the dichotomy. Certainly for the type of systemically corrupt countries or in-your-face corrupt countries that we're largely talking about here, because what I found in Afghanistan is that the two are connected. So what I came to understand is corruption was the operating system, really, of, as I said before, networks which were dynamic, and often there were rivalries within or amongst the networks, but that were basically, it's sort of like mafia families. Your one family has the waterfront and the other family has the casinos and things like that. But the point is, they were capturing revenue streams, and a gigantic revenue stream was in fact the so-called petty corruption that was rising up through the ranks, because the police officer who shakes you down, John's 3 drunken police officers, they have to pay part of their cut up the line. And so in Afghanistan, around 2010, there were 2 different bribery surveys done. And between the 2 of them, you got an estimate of between 2 and 5 billion US dollars a year in extorted bribes.
Sarah, is this the idea? Sorry to interrupt. Is this the idea of network corruption when you talk about? Is this
yes,
that concept?
I mean, that's the corruption that we are looking at around the world is, I think, you're right, the practice of sophisticated networks. And what I'm talking about here is the vertical integration of the networks, that money goes up the line vertically, and then what is handed down the line in return is impunity, is protection from repercussions. So that's one issue I actually have with the division between so-called petty and grand corruption, because the authors, the final authors, are often the same. The other point I'd like to make, though, has to do with the impacts of corruption, of severe corruption, beyond the monetary, which is to say the indignation that it gives rise to. So John was talking about the daily shakedowns, and it's not only the shakedown for money, it's the humiliation. So if you look, I watched it frequently in Kandahar, where a young man had to work pretty hard not to join the Taliban in Kandahar, Afghanistan. If a cop smacks him in the face often enough or breaks his windshield with his, the butt of his rifle, the kid is going to want to kill the cop, And similarly in Nigeria, where I heard a story about sextortion. And I'm thinking about the woman, of course, but I'm also thinking about her brother. You know, what does the brother want to do with a judge who committed an act like that? And you've got Boko Haram around. And so, but I also think that grand corruption can give rise to similar indignation. You know, in the case of Nigeria and Afghanistan, I think it was a significant driver of the insurgencies there. But I think you look at the Arab Spring, and while what touched it off was an act of petty corruption, I mean, when I visited Arab Spring countries in the midst of this in early 2011, I was seeing posters at demonstrations of government ministers behind bars, which was extremely radical public expression in some of those countries, in Egypt and Morocco in particular, I'm thinking. So, you know, so there you had a really major regional event that spun out of control in two countries into ongoing civil war. And so I'm just not positive that a distinction between petty and grand corruption is all that helpful.
Scott, I want to put it to you as part of a conversation about priority setting. Often, you know, corruption is linked to the fact that people have to pay a little bit more to get basic services that, you know, ordinarily government or other service providers should be giving. So when it comes to priority setting, to put up a straw man, some feel the priority should be to deliver services first, corruption-free services, if you like. You don't have to pay that extra toll, but accepting that corruption is unfortunate but unavoidable. What are the implications of such a strategy? Do you deliver services first, or do you deal with the corruption? It may be a false dichotomy, but you know, what's your priority setting? What's your prescription?
Karen, your straw man has a lot of straw in him.
Easily blown down.
Almost by definition, a corrupt service means you get less of the service, and it's harder to access it. I think the right way to ask the question on that is whether you can even deliver services in corrupt environments, right? And so as we sort of think about how are ways that you could frame that in I assume what you want is both forward-looking and operational ways. I think one thing that tends to get left out of that conversation is that large numbers of people in a developing country actually want the service, right? The people in the education ministry, you'd be amazed how many of them are dedicated and actually want their kids to be educated and everybody else's kids to be educated. And the same is true in every service that you're talking about. Nurses go to work despite not being paid for months on end and having no medicine because they're really committed to their job. Well, this is a resource for thinking about service and anti-corruption, and it doesn't get mobilized enough as something when you're thinking about, it's not just anti-corruption commissions and sending people to jail, but getting much more social buy-in for fighting against those kinds of processes. And I think, you know, you start looking at what a lot of corruption is, and if there's time, I'll tell you about some of the bribes I've had to pay as a project officer in these, right, on things along the lines of...
That's over a beer afterwards, I think.
In some of these, though, you take a look at, you know, people in Aceh after that tsunami, 200,000 dead people, and the world is trying to send books to these schools, and they're all locked up in a warehouse. Right now, there's 16 kids sharing a book in this little shack where they've lost all their parents recently. The principal of the school did pay a bribe to get the key to get into the warehouse and get it out. Now, why did he pay a bribe? Not only was he committed, he should have had the key in the first place. The system they set up was so inefficient, it had built the bribes into the system. And you see this over and over and over again. Yeah. The way a budget's been set up for paying people in both Indonesia, East Timor, Afghanistan also, there'll be 6 steps to get your payment released. We're talking about 500,000 people at a clip here. If you make a mistake in step number 6, you don't go back to step number 5, you go back to step number 1 and start the bribery ladder all over again. Now, a lot of those things can be simplified. Right? There's actually no reason to have 6 steps before to be able to pay somebody. There's no reason why the principal can't have access to the key that has all the books in there. And this is where I see development could actually make a useful contribution going forward. It's not just, I just think the whack-a-mole approach.
But isn't that, can I stop you, John? Can I just challenge you on something? Isn't
Sure,
some of the way those structures are in place are because of the need, particularly in some of the fragile context, to create jobs. And therefore you create almost false tiers. And at every level, as you say, there is an opportunity for someone to take a bribe. But, that conflicts directly with maybe a development objective. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the worst way to create a job. So I think you can take the problem, which is more job creation. I come back to what we were talking about a bit earlier, which is things that would block services are got to be the stupidest way you can think of to create a job for somebody, right? And there are other ways you can get those things done. But the forward-looking agenda, much as everyone trashes the DBI surveys these days, and they should, right? Those doing business indicators, they actually did lead to a lot of elimination of bribe creating entry points on getting permits, getting licenses, none of which was actually needed, right? And I think the same thing, some of the stuff I teach students is on public expenditure tracking to show all the different points before a book gets into a classroom, how many ways there are to steal money by all the licenses and rents and affirmations and audits you have to do, right? And most of those serve no function other than to put money into the system. So what I'm trying to do here is that both answer your question and reinforce Sarah's point that this counterposition between petty corruption and mega corruption, I think, takes you down rabbit holes that don't go in the right direction, right? And thinking a better place, again, I spent my life as a World Bank staff member, not as somebody who works in the legal or anti-corruption field. But the comparative advantage for development agencies is to simplify those systems, right? Let the legal advocates and the civil society advocates go after the people who slipped through, but nowhere near enough is going into the upfront work of why is it that hardworking nurses in a clinic cannot get medicine to treat their patients. And that's an area I think there is scope to go forward on by thinking about systems, not just tracing incidents.
Yeah, could I just
systems
jump
aren't
in?
necessarily in a vacuum. Yeah, Sarah, pick up.
Yeah,
I'm just wanting systems subject to politics, though, and creating jobs creates votes. Sarah.
But I think, Karen, stop me if I'm wrong, but I think a part of the thrust of your question has to do with what I was speaking about early on, which is, an aid practitioner, for example, will go in with a mission, which could be to provide sewage treatment, or it could be to provide HIV/AIDS vaccines, or what have you, and that mission is front of mind. And so typically, I think what practitioners do is they narrow, like a horse with blinkers, they narrow their sight on the delivery of that particular service or product. And everything else is seen as the way you facilitate or the way you achieve that objective. And what I would argue is that when development and aid projects are conceived of in this way, they are almost undermined from the get-go. And I think Ebola, again, this is not an area that I've worked in, but Ebola might be a good example of that, where, the West had constantly been providing, support to the medical systems of the countries that were hit, but because it didn't address because donor countries didn't really address the corruption problem, in the end, the very objective they were aiming for stayed out of reach, which is to say more healthy people in West Africa. And I would say the same is true of Afghanistan. I mean, I heard for 10 years that corruption later, Sarah, we're dealing with security. Well, look at the outcome. You lost the war. And so those, in my view, are almost always false trade-offs. You almost always fail to reach your stated objective if you go at it while shoving the corruption issue to the side. And so what I would say is that, again, forward-looking, I would like to see a lot more development programming build citizens' oversight into the substance of the project. I would say also that anytime, I held a meeting in Washington for aid organizations, be they multilateral or American, the people who would come would be the anti-corruption personnel. And that's not who I wanted to talk to. I wanted to talk to the straight, the mainline program leaders, so that Power Africa, for example, which was a huge USAID program to electrify parts of Africa, I wanted the person running that program in the room to start thinking about ways to make local communities, empower them to have oversight over both construction of projects and delivery of services, instead of corruption being shunted off, number one, to specialized personnel, and number two, to overhead, monitoring and overhead, which is always the part of the budget that people are trying to squeeze to be as small as possible. It has to be understood, I think, as a integral part of development or reconstruction programs.
John, you've been exposed to many settings where international aid and the war economy that is supported by international aid is prolific. What would be your prescription for better ways to provide international assistance while dealing with the issue of corruption?
I think I would add to the point that Sarah has just made. The model that we have adopted over the last 20 years has turned anti-corruption into an orphan in the institutional infrastructure of just development, growth, and just managing a society. So you have countries that are fragile, or countries with corruption problems, countries that are in the process of development, where the anti-corruption is parked in a little agency that is well funded. It has got a lot of engagement with the international community, all the USAID and the DFIDs and the World Banks are there. They sometimes paid even better salaries than everybody else. But actually, the real problems are in the Ministry of Finance, in the Ministry of Water. That's where the action actually is, and I think that's one of the big changes that needs to happen, to move from thinking about it as a problem that with one official who caused some laughter in Kenya by saying that I shall chase corruption like hunting down mice with a truncheon, and I'll hit them one at a time. Now, that has been shown to be totally unsuccessful. The mice multiply faster, and they're clever and much quicker than a senior official with a truncheon. Now, the thing is, I think we're coming to terms with the fact that some of the anti-corruption infrastructure that we have created for ourselves is not fit for purpose. That actually the real corruption is budgeted. It's sitting right in the budget. It's in the public works budget. It's in the roads budget. And actually, unless you are in there and understanding the repurposing of institutions and processes by actors, then your ability to deal with a problem is undermined. So it's I think there are many lessons that we have learned, but I think one of the important ones for me is that the parking of anti-corruption external to centers, especially in developing countries, the centers of power are quite concentrated. You'll have the Office of the President, Office of the Prime Minister, Ministry of Defense, and Ministry of Finance. That's it. Everybody else, it really just takes instructions. They get a call from the Permanent Secretary in the Office of the President, and policy can change quite quickly. So it's a matter of also understanding where to locate these initiatives properly. Right now, a lot of anti-corruption work are institutional orphans, like little coddled babies of the international community in many countries, well paid. They do very good reports, which are all available online in many countries. But when you read them, they're not strategic. They're like operational reports. We have arrested 200 officials in the past 1 year. The previous year we did 150, etc., etc., and it goes on and on and on. Whereas in the wider society, the problem seems to be growing and the outrage continues to build.
I love that phrase, institutional orphans. I think I'm going to steal that, John. That's great. Well, look, we don't have a lot more time, but I've got a question that I want to put all three of you. Scott is
Scott
waving
wants to wade in.
frantically.
Yeah.
No, Scott, I was about to put a question to you, but please, do you want to
Okay.
just pick up on John's point?
Yes, because it's an excellent point. I 100% agree. And I have to add an anecdote, right? So in 2014, I showed up in Afghanistan to work in the president's office and the Ministry of Finance, just as John's talking about, where corruption's already front and center, thanks to Sarah's book. It took 7 years to reach the mainstream, but it was front and center by then. What do you do about corruption? So by then, we have 350 international and national anti-corruption specialists scattered around the government. We have 15 civil society and governmental anti-corruption agencies that are going on. And we have audits coming literally once a month that are coming in. Meanwhile, I'm working inside the Ministry of Finance, and we commissioned 2 specialists to come from the Australian Treasury and just tell us where the vulnerabilities are inside the budget process. They come, they spend 4 months, and they come back and say, your entire national budget isn't a budget, it's an auction, right? And they break it down to every single step along the way where some elite is paying a bribe, either to get a project into the budget, to get projects out of the budget, to get projects moved through the budget. This is after $1 billion in technical assistance had gone into the Ministry of Finance, and what they had built was an auction house. So John is absolutely right on both ends of that equation. We had just an amazing number of civil society oversight mechanisms to take a look at the corruption. And we had an institutionalized corrupt system where it was the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Economy, and the ministries that were building things that literally were stealing close to 100% of the budget. And it was institutionalized for 20 years.
Scott, thank you very much. Stay there because I want to put this next question to you. You can have the first go at this. There's a lot of competition for policy space. You know, we're talking about climate change, conflict, the COVID pandemic, civic space. How does corruption measure up to these other problems that are competing for policy and political space globally? You know, are they independent or are they all interrelated?
Yeah,
Just
I'm a
in a few
lover
words.
instead of a splitter, right? So I basically think these are all aspects of governance failures. Right, the corruption is, crappy environment is, I think most poverty is, and so on. So I think something John said earlier, I think economics is a very powerful tool, but it's gotten too powerful. And I think there's something about political economy and understanding how not just government as organizations works, but government as constellations of class and resource contestations needs to be taken a lot more seriously if you're serious about reform in any of these areas. And that includes at the global level. Both Sarah and John have brought that up on the inequality and the way that interrelationships keep generating governance failures. They're not a mistake. They keep getting generated and regenerated over time. And the kind of actions people want to take to get reform in those areas. So for me, these are governance issues front and center, where there's a lack of both theory, but also practical action on what's going on. But there's a lot of experience out there, like you've been bringing out even in this conversation, that needs some synthesis and thinking through what would a next step sort of strategy look like for tackling some of these issues more effectively. We know it hasn't worked. We have a few examples that have worked, but we don't really have much of an organizing framework that's sufficiently robust that would sort of let you have some confidence. I think Sarah's entirely on the right track, that thinking of this as a technocratic exercise is the wrong way to go. It's a political exercise. And thinking about styles of engagement matters a lot. The point I've tried to make in my own projects and my own career is that you don't get to do very much. It's reformers in the system who do that, and you have to be on top of that. And the other point, which Sarah's entirely right about, at least in the programs I've worked on, is the more you can engage citizenry in oversight, direct interest, and action on these things, the better. That's easier to do to say than it is to do, right? You have a lot of marginalized and disempowered people who actually know that you don't have to show them that things are corrupt or you're not getting services. They know that. What are they supposed to do with that information, short of joining the Taliban? And so I think you have some practical questions to start solving, but I think it's the right framing is to think about governance failures, holding all those domains together.
Sarah, let me put it to you, but I'm also going to add another question to that. How do you make corruption matter in terms of the competition for policy space and political time? And given the proliferation of new tools to actually be able to highlight and deal with corruption to a certain extent, or at least expose it. We talked about the Pandora Papers earlier, but also some of the open source investigative tools, the open source data investigative tools. Does that make it more of an appealing policy choice, if you like, because there is a sense that more can be done about it?
I would go back to what John just said about anti-corruption practitioners and bodies being orphans. I think corruption is orphan. I don't think that people understand what were the problems that you mentioned as competing for policy space. You talked about COVID, you talked about climate.
Mm-hmm.
So if you understand corruption as the operating system of networks, key players, what I didn't talk about is the horizontal integration of these networks.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean by that is that they weave across these categories that we like to use to divide up our understanding of our society and our political systems, such as private sector and public sector. Yeah. So at least in English, we talk about the revolving door. In fact, that's the network weaving its way back and forth across the public and private sector. And key in those networks are energy producers and distributors, right? And so it is now clear that those companies which have benefited tremendously from their relationships, I would say their corrupt relationships with members of various governments, that they have been they've been actively working to shatter any kind of consensus on corruption, any kind of consensus on climate. And so what I'm trying to say is corruption underlies almost every one of the other problems that you mentioned. And so it's back to what we were saying about priorities in development. You're not going to solve any of those other issues if you don't address the underlying corruption that's driving them. So the problem, though, is that certainly in the developed world, I don't think a lot of our citizens understand that. And they are getting very wound up when they get activated. It tends to be about identity issues. It tends to be about various versions of who's my community and what injustice has been done to my community, instead of understanding that that's the best way the kleptocrats can keep us all divided, is have us scratching our eyes out over, whether women have a worse time of it or this other group has a worse, including the political divide. And what's amazing is these networks actually weave across very, very bitter political divides as well. So for me, there are two real problems. One is helping citizens understand that whatever issue is top of mind to them, like climate or COVID or even racial injustice, that below that is corruption as the fundamental driver. That's one problem. The second problem, though, is having looked at anti-corruption, I want to say insurgencies and insurrections over the last 10 to 15 years, I can't think, with maybe one exception, I can't think of a single case where a charismatic person of integrity, reformer of integrity, captured that public anti-corruption indignation. Too often, you either get spoilers like the Taliban or Boko Haram, or you get front men for the corrupt networks like Jimmy Morales in Guatemala, or you get, out and out members of the kleptocratic networks themselves, like Donald Trump. And that is a huge failing. Our team has failed to generate a genuinely a person capable of mobilizing the population in this, I think, almost existential fight. So the new media and things like that are important because they reveal more facts, but without institutions to follow up on the revelations, without political determination on the part of the very classes that benefit from corruption, without a leader who might have to be drawn from those classes, a sort of modern day Franklin Roosevelt, to lead the charge, I'm not sure how much good, on their own, I think the revelations are not going to get us where we need to go.
Sarah, thank you. I mean, there are lots of people that are trying to lead the charge, and I think of particularly in African context, places like the Mo Ibrahim Foundation that reward leaders that are supposedly not corrupt. But that's for a different conversation. John, your final thoughts. Corruption is often presented across Africa and in fragile states in Africa in particular through a security lens, and that seems to keep it quite high up the policy agenda because of the links between corruption and security or insecurity. But what's your prescription to make corruption matter and for it to basically fight its corner with competing policy priorities?
Yeah. Corruption is the cockroach of development. It is resilient. You can drop an atom bomb on it, keep on walking when everything else is gone. It is there. It simply one of the mistakes again that we realize that we have made is this securitization of governance in many areas, that has come with the war against terror, especially in quote unquote fragile states, that elites have learned how to manipulate. National security is the last refuge of the corrupt. It is an absolute winner for corrupt elites, because that's where you can do the single sourcing. Sadly, it's a cynical kind of thing amongst media. If you have a big visitor coming from the West, that's when the bombs seem to go off, and the dollars seem to follow. So I think that I would still go back to the fact that corruption is something that needs to be addressed differently from as I said, we've let the economists run the show for too long, and that its location in society, the networks that dominate the repurposing of institutions for private commercial gain are usually in a few places in developing countries. But I can tell you that in our part of the world, 9/11, then the invasion of Iraq, especially, and we could feel the change that took place as resources shifted away from governance, corruption, etc., to counterterrorism. And the corruption issue said, hold on, sometimes it might even be useful. We need some of those gangsters. And those kind of attitudes have caused major problems, and all the procurement scandals, especially in the security sector, have emerged largely as a result of that. So for me, my final point is also always to keep in mind, especially for young people, talking about the African context where we have the world's youngest population. Corruption is a powerful and virulent mobilizer of youth and youth attitudes. And it captures their imagination. And sometimes it may be incompetence that they're viewing, but it is best, because of the behavior of an elite, it is best described and understood as the venality of a conspicuously corrupt elite. and that has political consequences in terms of stability. And the security challenges are there. And the securocrats make the money, and those who service those contracts, unfortunately, are integral to some of the most corrupt networks across the continent. And unfortunately, the same actors you find in Kenya are across the continent, especially in the security sector.
John, let's leave it at that. To my guests, I'd like to thank you warmly for your real candor and your insightful comments. It's been a fabulous discussion. It really has. The issue obviously is extremely complex, it's multi-layered, and it's highly nuanced, but too important to ignore. I think the key takeaways from this discussion is that in fragile conflict or violence-affected states, anti-corruption can't be siloed. It can't be institutionalized. It can't be an institutional orphan, to coin one of John Githongo's amazing metaphors. I have to say, we've had a whole alphabet soup of metaphors. It has to be integrated into development assistance programs and peacemaking deals. Corruption isn't just about money, it's about relationships and power relationships. And international aid practitioners need to understand that governance needs to be stamped into the DNA of assistance programs and peace deals. It's not a second priority. Finally, fighting petty corruption and grand corruption has to happen hand in hand. It can't be sequenced. The two are interrelated, as the panelists, as our guests here described. Thank you all once again. A real warm thanks to my esteemed guests. Once again, thank you very much for the viewers. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion as much as we have. There are some fabulous books on this issue. Sarah Chayes, to give a quick push for her book, books I would strongly recommend. But besides that, it's been a fabulous discussion, and the first of many, I hope. Many thanks.